Hello, everyone. Welcome to the show today. We got a good one for you, as always. We have a pretty solid lineup. We got reaction, fallout from the big coup in Russia, where the Wagner group has pretty much just been sent home or into the arms of Lukashenko in Belarus. Really pretty crazy situation. Militarily, it was very calm, but it politically, many people are saying is going to have a very major impact. Also, Sam Alito is the latest Supreme Court justice to kind of be caught double dealing, using his influence for some pretty big perks, this time for his wife. You know, he's a family man at heart. Trump is still not backing, a national abortion ban, and evangelicals even do not care. A very big moment from the Faith and Freedom Caucus that we'll get into. And what is really sad of our times, Iowa meteorologist resigning after receiving death threats for talking about climate change. Really just part of, in my opinion, really a world where a lot of people are just getting stupider in a pretty fundamental way. Or just not even getting stupider, but just critical thinking skills, maybe because of online, are just being really fundamentally degraded. We got a very good guest to discuss it all. James Weld is joining us. James, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I always enjoy my attendance on this show.
Loaded it up. I always enjoy your presence for sure. But yeah, loaded up the story. Well, not really, but we're definitely going to do a lot of foreign policy at a time where really foreign policy is in the news. So it's perfect to have a Georgetown Foreign Services School student on the show to talk about it. Oh, that is for sure. So it has been a crazy weekend in Russia, and not even really in Ukraine. We obviously talked about it on the Friday into Saturday show that I recorded like 11:45, as it was really all going down. The Wagner group leader Evgeny I always mess up his name, Prigozhin. That sounds all right, I feel like. Do you think?
That's what we're going with, at least.
Yeah.
That's all I know.
There we go. But he was a pretty controversial and critical from the right, I mostly understand. But he kind of make some critiques against the oligarchy of Putin and his cabal, who are not doing this in the fundamental best interest and lying to the soldiers and the people of Russia. He said he was turning his army of 25,000 on to Moscow for really kind of political reasons, implying that not necessarily he would go for Putin, but he really wanted to change the Ministry of Defense. And then he got to essentially halfway to Russia before, of all people, Alexander Lukashenko of Belarus, halfway to Moscow, before Alexander, from essentially what was the Ukrainian border, and really far south, before Alexander Lukashenko, the long perceived puppet of Putin, came in and negotiated a peace deal where they're going to send the leader Prigozhin to Belarus, and they will give the Wagner fighters the option to either go to Belarus, go home, or fight for officially the Russian army, because they were originally a private military company. Just a crazy situation all around. James, what was your reaction? Were you just following this as closely as I was on Saturday night?
So I first saw that headline like earlier in the day, the day he made the declaration. So all of these like Popular Front, Atlas News, like all of the conflict supporting or the conflict journalist Instagrams were like putting out stuff about it, and I saw it, and I don't really think the gravity of what it actually meant hit me in that moment, but I think honestly the stuff that Yevgeny or Prigozhin, the stuff that he said right before actually taking up arms, I think is going to be some of the most damaging words in the entire 2 decades of Putin ruled Russia, because he told the public from a figure of clout, like someone that the state had like kind of uplifted, a group that the state had. There were banners for Wagner PMC. He told the public, this guy with clout who cannot easily be silenced, they lied to you. Ukraine was never going to attack Russia in the Donbass right before we went to war. Like thousands of Russians have died. They're lying to you about that. They're incompetent, and the Ministry of Defense has committed crimes against my company. And I think that declaration, like, who in Russia could look at this and not see the false justification for the war in the first place? I mean, forgetting the cutting off of the Russian economy, forgetting the war dead and the economic destruction. This is coming from a guy that the state built up. They can't just say, after months of supporting his group, they can't just say, oh, he's crazy. Like, they're going to try, but realistically, what support does Putin have amongst the public? Because people in Russia were not taking up arms for the government, but border guards were letting Wagner go within 2 kilometers or 200 kilometers of Moscow.
Yeah.
They let them go up a highway. That is illustrative of how weak Putin's support actually is in this moment. And for me, beyond the historicity of it, that is going to be my biggest takeaway. Is it really showed how fragile his fortress is. Because a fortress looks strong and stable from the outside, but on the inside, it could be a rotten structure. And I think that this uprising will go down as a defining moment in which people realized how weak the government's authority is over the monopoly of violence and over its own citizenry right now. That's my takeaway in broad terms.
Yeah, I definitely agree with the parts about like the shattering of it. It was very, very clear. But yeah, I really do. I think for the Russian people themselves, like I would say, there's 2 things to this. I feel like it's very possible, at least from what I've seen, which is definitely very little, but I feel like it's definitely very possible that through, not everyone's going to be on Telegram. Definitely a large swath of the country. It's such a massive country, and I don't know anything about like the political geography. Like, it's very possible that a bunch of them just, are going to get their news from so many of the state-owned sources.
The state
which
sources
is very possible they just will not be talking about it at all. But then the other side of it is, do they even matter in what is the future of Putin's government? Because they could just, given the history of Russia, given the way the culture of it is there, obviously no offense to them, it should be a lot better, but they are kind of used to being kind of just dragged along by whatever authoritarian figure or force that's been put in place. And yeah, I feel like they would not be too surprised. But what I've heard, I saw a headline when I was looking into this, was like the elite are shaken by the Putin supporting elite, the oligarchs who he really made a big deal of getting on his side, could be really questioning themselves after this, which I think certainly makes sense. But what would be their course of action, especially with regards to the Ukraine war, which is going to be bleeding their country dry for sure.
So I definitely agree in a qualified sense, in that I think people in Russia, there's going to be a lot of them that never see the message. They're not on Telegram. They get their news from the state-owned sources, as you said.
Or they'll see some diluted or spun.
Yeah. The word of mouth effect is pretty important here, I would say, because what he puts out on Telegram, because he's such a closely followed figure, and because the coup attempt was so high profile, I think that there will be significant word of mouth relaying of a version of what he said at the very least. But that's kind of irrelevant, as you say, because really it's not the people that are the most important factor here. It's the oligarchy and those around Putin and their support that is really going to determine what happens. And they're definitely shaking right now. I mean, there's no way in which this narrative ends in, everything just goes well, right? I mean, thus far, given the story of Russia in this war, it would be a miracle for them to pull it back to a place of stability in accomplishing what they want and restoring domestic tranquility. And just to add a final thing to that, I will say that if you look at Russia's history, can you hear me? Did I cut out for a part of that?
You're good. Yeah.
Okay. If you look at Russia's history, they are led, it is a non-democratic cultural tradition. If you look at the history, there has been no successful functioning democracy in Russia except for perhaps a brief period in the 1990s that has to be qualified by the oligarchs, the crony capitalism, Yeltsin, etc. But regardless, if you look at Russian history, defining moments of its change came from popular uprising. The fall of the Soviet Union, to some extent was and was not a popular uprising because public pressure was extremely important, but you did not see mass revolution in Russia as you did in Romania or in the Eastern Bloc countries. It was a little bit of a mixed revolution between, palace coup and immense popular pressure. And you see Russians in the Russian Revolution, in the Civil War, like, military command was the most important thing, yes, but they were fundamental expressions of popular will in one way or another. The fall of the Tsar could not have happened without the overwhelming hatred of the people for the institution in that moment, or at least the desire for them to change it. And I think it really is too early to say one way or the other whether Putin is about to be the Nicholas II or whether he is going to be Vladimir Lenin and pull this situation from the brink at which it's at. It is early to say, but I just can't emphasize enough how historical these couple of days have been. And like looking at it and really thinking like, I am living through this moment right now. Like how it's so astronomically different from the environment in which I grew up, expecting America to be like the unipolar controller of the world, that like, it feels so immense. I don't know.
Yeah, honestly, I feel like that is very interesting that you say that, because I felt like up until Lukashenko made that deal, and by the way, I just a very, very true point about the Russian history being also really changed by popular revolutions and all that. But
right,
that is totally definitely going to be a factor. But yeah, I really thought it was when they were like marching towards Moscow, they were threatening to, because apparently I heard this anecdote that's like Putin is like watching, he sits in a room, turns on video of Gaddafi after he was overthrown in Libya, and just to put it mildly, some very, very bad things happened to him on video, and it was seen all over the world. And that was about to happen literally to him. And the fact that would have been, I feel like, absolutely insane. But then the fact that, Lukashenko stepped in and really made this deal out of nowhere kind of made me feel like, just nothing happens, nothing major happens. But, it did feel like for a while, thinking of Vladimir Lenin, made me think of the classic, history. Sometimes there's a decade where nothing happens, and then where a decade happens. That
I was gonna bring up that quote actually.
That was like it was right there. But yeah, that like I do. It's definitely worth considering because it's like obviously there's no way of being absolutely sure. We know nothing, especially we're no experts, and even really the experts don't know here in America too much about Russia. But yeah, it is worth considering. Like, is it more like that, or is it another thing where a major event was just subsided for now?
Right. Well, to draw once more upon the example of Russian history, there's a moment that has been brought up in the news a lot recently among like kind of academic analyses of this. It's called the Kornilov affair or the Kornilov Putsch. It was it was a coup d'état attempt by a Russian general against the Russian Republic, which briefly existed between the Empire and the Soviet era. The Kornilov coup was a right-wing general who was dissatisfied with the government of the Russian Republic and marched on Moscow to attempt to overthrow it. He was defeated, but in a couple of months after that, the Russian Republic fell to the Bolsheviks in the revolution. So, in a way, that example, a right-wing general rising up against a government that is rapidly losing popular support, it does ring true with the consequence of, greater things later, like the Soviets taking control. This is probably like the stage. What's the word for it? It's like a preview.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've seen we're at the base of what's going to be a seismic change. Seismic change doesn't just mean the government falls, because it's very possible the government doesn't fall, but fundamentally Russian culture, Russian society, this war will leave things differently from how they started, and there is no way to reconcile those two things.
Yeah, I feel
this war will be a defining,
defining
moment for Russia in this century, this 21st century, and I think this coup is going to be a huge part of that seismic change.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's so interesting. I do want to get to this part here about Putin, and especially because Putin obviously is going to be the next big thing. Like, how are the people who really prop him up, the oligarchs, how are they going to respond to what is a clear sign of I don't know. I do think some stuff about the Wagner people being left. They were like a huge, essentially like army patrolling that M4 highway in Moscow. I think it was like to see that a couple border guards would have like tried to stop them. I feel like is. I think they put it unrealistic. That was like a quote actually from the FSB border guards who are letting them into Ukraine. But it definitely does not rule out the fact that people, especially on the front lines of the war, maybe people in military connected professions, or people who know people in the military who know how it actually is going and how pointless it is, could be in very much of a be the tip of the spear in terms of making a big change on this. But also there's the elite, the oligarchs who are propping them up. Here is how he responded today. This is in the New York Times. President Vladimir Putin making his first public comment since a paramilitary revolt was called off on Saturday, saying in an angry 5-minute speech, the uprising led by Evgeny Prigozhin, who he did not mention by name, which is pretty interesting, failed because the entire Russian society united. It's like he doesn't want to give the media clips of him speaking. They don't want to associate it almost, I feel like, is a big part of it. They wanted Russians to fight each other. Putin said they rubbed their hands, dreaming of taking revenge for their failures at the front. So talking about the Wagner group during the so-called counteroffensive, but they miscalculated. He said, thanking the Russian military. So it's a pretty, he's definitely clear. He had the very stern face, even more stern than usual, kind of coming out there, especially over the last two public speeches that he's made. He appeared again on TV, notably a second time on Monday, in a brief snippet of a meeting with his defense secretary, Sergei Shoigu still on side. He's still in the pictures at the cabinet meetings and such. So he is still around. But yeah, really, really interesting. I feel like, Putin was ready to go all in on this guy. But, was it really, the craziest part about it, and again, something we can never really truly know, is like, was it really Lukashenko who got him in a room and it was like, this is just going to mean Russians killing Russians, and both sides, given their patriotism, they're probably like, oh, I generally do not want that. And they're deeply held kind of beliefs on that. And that was, I feel like, was probably the only thing, at least totally reading the tea leaves again, that got them to like pull away and step back from the brink.
Well, I think that Lukashenko is a character that seems unlikely to be able to really like step into a room with those guys and have he is the leader of a vassal state of Russia. Yes. And it is an important player, but this is a deeply personal feud between two men, and Lukashenko is kind of just the fat uncle of the East Slavic countries.
His country is basically
now,
a staging
I will say,
area for the war.
Yeah, I think that he may have been involved in it to some extent. Perhaps his desire to reclaim some sovereignty from Russia, which has been collapsed, obviously, since Belarus had a democratic movement in 2020, and Russian security forces were the ones that silenced it. Lukashenko, since then, has seen his country become more and more an appendage of Russia, so perhaps in brokering the deal, he's trying to reclaim some bargaining chips from Vladimir Putin. It is possible. It's equally possible that they just needed to put someone else's name on it so it wouldn't be seen that Putin was cutting a deal just to let the guy go, because it was unrealistic that he would be able to take it. However, it's not impossible. And I think it's
like, if you're Putin and you're already bombing your own roads, bombing your own infrastructure, bombing people who've already fought you in the front in a real way with all that blood, he's losing way more than Wagner, even if that thing starts. I think
a battle would be horrible.
That is honestly a very good theory. I feel like that they were just like, okay, let's say that Lukashenko, you act like you did everything, but really it was us coming in, because apparently they never all three had a conversation. It was just correct me if I'm wrong, but they were just going back and forth, and Lukashenko being the intermediary, and then perhaps Putin really saying, I don't want this, but Lukashenko has to take the credit. That would fit much more with the pattern of subservience completely of Belarus to Russia, or especially over, as you said, that 2020 democratic suppression.
I agree. I definitely agree with that. I think with regard to Putin's support among the oligarchs, I definitely think that it's been eroded significantly even since the start of the war, and probably more so as a result of this rebellion. But I think that the real deciding factor beyond the oligarchs is whether they can translate their discontent into an actual clandestine movement within the security service or the military to get rid of Putin. Because he is protected by, a highly devotional, highly trained unit of the Russian army. It's hard to assassinate an unpopular dictator. It's not impossible at all, but it can be hard if they have the power and the military strength to be able to really defend themselves. Mm-hmm. I think that what it would take would be significant oligarch discontent that could be coordinated somehow with communication, with a plan within the FSB or the Ministry of Defense or the Spetsnaz to actually execute an arrest or an execution or something else. Regime change is hard, but, with the Lenin quote, a decade can happen in a week. So it's really hard to say one way or the other. And I think that when the moment comes, whatever that moment might be, we won't expect it.
Yeah, I definitely think so. And I definitely get the sense, although it's so hard to say for sure, that it would seem logical that we are in this kind of it's like I want to believe it, but I can't quite get myself there. Is like the feeling that there's something really big kind of coming around the corner. But I definitely could see.
I agree.
I definitely could see some sort of real push, especially with the people who are again propping Putin up. Just say we got to just draw down this Ukraine war. It's becoming too much. Make some concessions to Zelensky, and really get him kind of around the table and just make it even if it has to be embarrassing, got to get this done. And that's really what he would do if he was smart, and that would probably be in the best interest of the Russian oligarchs, because maybe they even could get some sanctions lifted. I bet by the EU would be like, let's go, let's get back in business right away. So I feel like that could be a very likely scenario as well. It would be a logical scenario, but again, you just do not know, because it's very rarely ever works like that, in the world, let alone Russia.
I completely agree. I think that it's we all thought that Iran was going to be throwing off the theocracy like in the fall of 2022 with the protests and everything. Like we all hoped for something big, something's coming, they're going to throw off the Islamic Republic, and they're not done, the protests, but that revolution didn't quite come about, even though it seemed like it was really going to. And it's easy to see how that could happen here. So there's always like a lot of doubt in me, don't get your hopes up, because this is not going to be a cakewalk.
Yeah. I feel like the most... go ahead.
Or go ahead. No, you go ahead.
Oh, yeah, but I was just thinking that like the most likely thing, I feel like, is that, or the biggest, most relevant question would be, do the elites control Putin, or does Putin control the elites? Or can they, if they really all get together, and that in itself is a pretty big historic, task in and of itself, to get all these disparate kind of oligarchs in there and be like, Putin, we got to make a deal with Zelensky. But I feel like that would be a big step in kind of ending this conflict, making, the government of Russia stronger, which certainly could happen. But yeah, it seemed to be very interesting. I totally see what you're saying, also with the Iran thing, and just a very common trend. I feel like just seeing with all, especially another instance of this is so many people with zero COVID talking about China is going to be in trouble. The Xi Jinping, like that could be a real problem. It's definitely much less realistic than the Iranian thing. But with China, there was so many people being like, it's just one more wave away. But I'm just like, just don't underestimate. Like, you can hate them, you can say whatever you want about them, but you can't deny they do know how. Like they are a government that knows how to like run things more efficiently. Obviously because they are a command economy or
right.
Yeah, government economy. But
yeah, there's a lot of state intervention in the economy for sure.
Yeah, so that is definitely going to be, an aid there. But it really does, one of those examples of just people getting really invested in and characterize, like, I don't know, just hyping up these revolutionary movements against these evil governments that do not tend to work out well. Kind of going to the other side of the coin here with this Wagner group, it could be very interesting because it was a very soft deal that Prigozhin, really after coming out and Putin said himself, mutinying against the established government, he just gets to go essentially chill in Belarus, and the future of his group remains unclear. It still could even go on, but I highly doubt it. He said very much that earlier Monday, very kind of calm and almost in some ways apologetic. That he was not intending to oust Putin, and that or I guess chastened would be a better word, that he was only protesting new law that he said would effectively halted Wagner's operations in Ukraine, trying to force him to sign up to the Russian army. The Kremlin sought to project an era of normalcy, again, releasing Shoigu, which is releasing a video with Shoigu, the first time since the uprising, appearing to signal that he remained in his post, despite scathing criticism from Putin. I think what happens with the Wagner Group, especially how they deal with the soldiers, how they deal with, Prigozhin. If he winds up dead in like a month and a half, and all the Wagner Group, mercenaries are forced to sign into the Russian army, or just go back home, or probably get drafted again. Honestly.
Right.
It seems like that would be a very clear win, and to sign that Putin's in control. But if stuff like he starts to slip through, starts to cause trouble again, then it could be, I think it could be a real indicator.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to see the dissolution on the front. What does the end of Wagner really mean? If you take that as the scenario that's gonna actually happen, which I think is the most likely, I think a lot of these guys are gonna be kind of forcefully conscripted. Like they say, oh, they can go home, but I'm not sure if that's really gonna be allowed to happen. But we can all agree that the Ministry of Defense is incompetent. Wagner was the best unit that they had, aside from Spetsnaz, and the highest, because the problem is not the training of the unit necessarily, it's the command structure. Wagner knew how to fight a war better than the Russian military does. So if all of these guys and all of their equipment get subsumed into the Russian military, I just think it makes the Russian military weaker, because then they won't have Wagner around, who are well trained, see themselves as the premier fighting force, see themselves as separate. There's no way this could go better for Russia than it was before the uprising. So I think that's a boon to Ukraine. And Ukraine, during this crisis, pushed on 3 fronts in the east and the southeast. They tried to capitalize on the chaos in that moment, and I can guarantee that, whatever happens with Wagner, they're going to capitalize on the destabilization and the lack of morale, and everything. This is not good for the state, and it's just a boon to Ukraine, no matter what happens.
That is for sure. I mean, if I were them, I don't know why they're not, all the way up in Crimea by now with the chaos that's been going on. But yeah, that is definitely another factor. So much spilling around on this, and hopefully we will see some questions answered in the near future. But honestly, given the way things are, and a lot of the times I very highly doubt it. But we are now going to move on to our next story, and bringing it back home into Washington with a pretty common theme that we've seen a lot this year, starting with Clarence Thomas. We talked about it. And we have another instance. I think Roberts was a problem. We talked about Alito, and Alito's back again. Actually, it's Sam Alito's wife, who leased land to an oil and gas firm while the justice fought the EPA. This is in the Intercept here. We'll do the first few paragraphs. A year ago this month, Martha Ann Baumgartner Alito decided to see if a 160-acre plot of land in Grady County, Oklahoma, would produce oil. In a lease filed with the Grady County clerk, the wife of the Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito entered into an agreement with the Citizen Energy 3 for revenue generated from oil and gas obtained from a plot of hardscrabble she inherited from her late father. It is one of the thousands of oil and gas leases across Oklahoma, which is obviously one of the state's one of the top fossil fuel producing states in the country. Last year, before the lease was activated, a line in Alito's financial disclosures labeled mineral interests was valued between $100,000 and $250,000 if extraction on the plot proves fruitful, the lease dictates that Citizen Energy will pay Alito's wife 3/16 of all money that it makes from oil and gas sales. And in the past, so he's obviously recused himself from cases that pose potential conflicts of interest with his vast inherent investment portfolio. But because Citizen Energy is it's not even up with any forces of the court, but it does, again, one of those stories, one of those instances where we see just broader Supreme Court corruption and just the vast financial interests of Supreme Court justices, and really also their wives too, which was just a very convenient cop out for essentially a proxy for them, and also to the family members, all things like that. Like, even if this one story is not too much of a big deal and is a very small example of what we're talking about broadly, it is definitely something that I think is welcome, and rightly so, to come into to the public light and get much better exposure, because it is such a problem with again, a court that completely decides so much of our country and is obviously unelected.
Yeah, I think that the Supreme Court, with the overall politicization and polarization of American society, has become less and less representative as a body over time, and further out of step with what American people actually want, because of the structure, the 9 justices, the lifetime appointments. It's not exactly like a very democratic or representative system, because its intention, I think, with the founders was less. I don't know. I think that the polarization has challenged the structures of the American judicial branch. But putting that aside, with regard to the ethics violations here, I mean, they have so little oversight that is actually meaningful. And the impeachment process is not really a real threat for these justices. And, with the revelations about Harlan Crow and Clarence Thomas adding this onto it, or even his wife, Ginny Thomas, Clarence Thomas's wife, her involvement with efforts to overturn the 2020 elections, it just seems like they're a body of non-elected lifetime appointees that are out of step with America and frequently conduct themselves in a way that is unbecoming of an ethically upright court. And, I would promote a reform of it. And what that reform might look like is hard for me to describe. And I would probably just tack myself on to someone who's a lot smarter, who's thought a lot more and read a lot more law to determine. But yeah, I think that the Supreme Court is just showing itself to desperately need, public insight right now in many ways, in ethics and in their representation for what Americans want and what, is actually constitutionally permitted.
Yeah, especially
and,
yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that's my take.
Yeah. And especially 1 year since Roe versus Wade kind of came out, or was leaked to come out, it is very clear with the polls, with the research, with the reaction, people are just not happy with what the Supreme Court is doing. Even if they're not the biggest fans of abortion, they're just like, we have such an unaccountable, such a powerful body. I mean, again, there's a lot of different things you could do with the court, packing it. I mean, honestly, I feel like, just the idea that these laws, could be interpreted, just such a binding effect. The binding voice of the Supreme Court is just one big problem for me. Term limits, I think, would be an interesting way of going about it, but there's, so giving everyone a chance to make it just drop the mask and make it just blatantly political, like it already clearly is.
Right.
And yeah, there's so many different ways that you could go with it. And it really is, though, almost kind of cliche to say it's fundamentally broken, because it's all parts of our government are broken. And it's the I guess the mechanism that's kind of there is like you want to have rely on the Senate for, as you said, impeachment, but it's like this really pervasive attitude in Washington that's almost like to acknowledge that the court is in need of reform is to legitimacy. To admit that there's a problem is to, in the eyes of the American people, just ruin the mystique and the magic of the court, almost like it's a Wizard of Oz type dynamic. When Americans see what's going on and realize the court is so problematic and just completely unable to carry out any sort of democratic will, and any kind of step with what the people want, is often reversing major things that people want. Roe v. Wade just obviously being the biggest example of many, and excuse me, it could be, the will is definitely there.
I think the part about pageantry and mystique is so important. I mean, the coronation of the king of the United Kingdom is, an old man getting dressed up in a goofy costume to go and participate in this fairyland tradition. And I think that the Supreme Court, as you say, you can't let the eyes of the people see the anointing of the king, and the same way you can't let the American people inside the lives of these deified 9 lifetime appointees. And the pervasive attitude, I do think, yes, it's obviously it's cliche, the government's broken because, it's all broken. But in this case, just the polarization of, I think about this a lot, but the U.S. Constitution was structured without necessarily regard for the intensity of potential political polarization, like the way that we draw districts, the way that we have the Senate as a disproportionate body, the way the Electoral College is unbelievably and undemocratic. When these systems were designed in the 18th century, it's so incomprehensible for us to imagine, but the politics of the 18th century was much more fluid than what we have now. Like parties like the Whigs and the Tories in the United Kingdoms, or the United Kingdom, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans were only ever vague kind of identities that people would drift from. So the polarization of the society in which our system was designed in was way different to the intense gridlock that we have established since then. They simply weren't built to handle this kind of scenario. And now we're seeing their defects come out. The defects in, a court wrangling over that one majority justice, getting a 5-4 in your favor as a party, is a spectacle. That was not the intention of the founders. And that's a cliche in itself, but that was not what this was supposed to be about, but it's what it's become.
Yeah, there's so many places to kind of jump off from that, because it's like you have it goes back to, as it's a little bit of a plug I've got to make here for my other podcast about history, hidden history, and breaking down the most under discussed parts of history every Fridays. Last Friday we were talking about on Juneteenth week, talking about Reconstruction history, talking about how the parties at the time, all throughout the Civil War period, were completely really almost ideologically, but also very much geographically based. You just have, north to south, obviously big dividing line, but you'd have, Democrats being made up of Irish, Italian immigrants, very poor, very working class. And also, at the same time, you would have the bourbon Democrats of the South. You would have, and then you had obviously the Republicans with the newly freed slaves, and then you had the people in the North and the Midwest, like the working. It was very just spread out, and oftentimes made no sense. And then just finally, kind of cohered a lot around the ideologies. But I feel like even still, there is this kind of ideological new ideological, this third, like the third way, the establishment, the uniparty, whatever you want to call it. It's been said a lot of times in the past, where it's like, even when you have Dick Durbin, democratically controlled Senate, all he's going to do is just write a letter, and that is going to be the most, that you're going to get from even the left wing, even the more, supposed to challenge power part of the government, which is really what I feel like, is a sign of a marked degrading from years past, where if something really wasn't getting done, someone at least would have tried to exercise some control, exercise some, put their foot in the gears, put a stick in the gears, so to speak, just be like, this isn't working, we got to do a new path, even if it was for the worse. And now we just see people just being like, it is the way it is. I'm 80 years old. Why not? Why write anything more than a letter, even in Democratic leadership case? But that is a big obstacle. I feel like to so much of this stuff.
I agree. I think the establishment system that we have here, it favors octogenarians. It favors tradition. It favors people staying in office over time. It's just not very well built to accommodate public opinion or ethics or morality. It's very much a system that, you get what's there, but at the same time, as you say, that sense of resignation means that there's fewer and fewer people actually able to throw their foot in the gear in a way that's not, outrageously ridiculous, like a Lauren Boebert or a Marjorie Taylor Greene. I guess they're throwing their foot in the gear, but not in a way that anyone wants.
They're just having these like kind of Real Housewives style fights on the house floor, calling each other like little bitches about.
Yeah.
The question was like the best part about like the headlines. Oh, Marjorie, like Lauren. I think it was Marjorie calling Lauren like little bitch on the house floor for copying articles of impeachment against Joe Biden, and with the Democratic controlled Senate, just again.
That's hilarious.
Yeah, it's just so that is what they're used to, and it's definitely kind of a sign of politicians been mattering less and less. It's all controlled by external forces of just the market, and just broadly talking about how that is so influential. But it's still fun to talk about the politicians anyway, and one of those fun politicians who's the most fun to talk about, let's be honest, is Donald Trump, who is back with the religious conservatives and the Faith and Freedom Conference, is where it is, the Road to the Majority Conference, a long road, but yeah, still doesn't matter when you have, again, things like the Supreme Court. Where some activists and lawmakers urged the party to embrace a ban on abortion after 15 weeks, he didn't commit to the legislation, avoiding a topic that's tripped up some Republicans in the first post-Roe election. Which, again, Democrats watching this very closely, and it'll be very interesting. I think this would probably be one of the biggest things that will keep 2024 close, is what's probably going to be, at least from the top of the ticket, a relatively chill on abortion message. But the crazy thing is, and the reason why this is so newsworthy, the Faith and Freedom, like evangelical crowd that was skeptical of Trump with abortion, responded to the message that Trump made, which was, I stopped Roe v. Wade. I'm going to stand up to the demented Democrats with their late-term abortions. He even said they're executing babies after they come out, which is like,
oh my God.
This is like,
that's ridiculous.
Like, and he just says that again because he knows what's popular, and just like that's like kind of doing a more extreme version of what people on TV are saying.
Yeah.
Which is like even more so crazy. It's like, but this idea, it's like ridiculous in so many levels. But then the crowd was like giving him cheers. So like, no talk about an abortion ban. No talk about anything like that. No, not even talk about 15 weeks. He called Ron DeSantis' 6-week abortion ban brutal. That I think is a huge, huge deal.
That is definitely huge.
Were you surprised to see that the evangelical conservatives even were really chill about and just I'll listen to some of the audio. You can hear this woman going, "Yes!" Like even in the background, like when they're talking about no mention of anything radical on abortion. Maybe I guess they're just assuming it, but it's like I feel like that is a very big deal.
I think he really runs as an exception to the rest of the field in that
totally
his actions. I mean, in a right world of rationality and logic, his actions would long ago have disqualified him with the authentic evangelical crowd. But Trump has taken this niche that I don't think many people knew existed, where you could be more or less, completely deified to the point where, barring killing someone, you could pretty much do everything, and that's including sexual assault. Because of his identity, his following, his aura, and things like I Killed Roe, getting the 6-3 majority for the Republicans.
That's really all you need to say if you're a Republican.
There's a lot of right-wing stuff that he got, but he is just immune from weakness amongst the Republican base. I mean, he was essentially found guilty, found liable for damages for sexual assault, yes, but that is more or less a guilty verdict.
Yeah.
For raping a woman, and the evangelical Christians continue to clap and be there. I think, honestly, for the other Republicans in the field, it's pretty futile. I mean, maybe Ron DeSantis, if he really just takes him. I know. I mean, it's like his poll numbers are going down after the indictment. How does that?
Just because more people are jumping in the race and taking off Iran. It's clear what they're doing there, and I feel like the indictment is going to help him win the Republican primary because it just again makes him more attention, feeds in the narrative that because really I think they lost. Like the Republicans believe, like the average Republican position, you have to understand. I feel like people just don't understand like that the average Republican position on the Justice Department is that it is politicized, can't trust anything that's about it. It is written off. It is essentially the same as MSNBC. Especially under Joe Biden and Merrick Garland, and that is going to be like just devalue completely any kind of ruling that they have. And it just also feeds in the narrative that he's A, in center of attention, and B, pissing off the liberals more than anyone.
For sure.
Which really is what gets him across. But also, Ron DeSantis, it's hard to mount a campaign, but against Trump, I feel like in the Republican Party, but DeSantis is doing a pretty bad job of it as well.
I think DeSantis, as a roach-like creature, people have found to be quite unappealing when they actually meet him.
That is a underrated, but it's can't. I feel like you can't highlight that enough. He's just
such a brick. I mean, and all his stuff with Disney. I mean, he was popular in Florida, but realistically, like the Trump crowd sees him as a traitor, and a critical mass of Trump supporters stayed with Trump, and that critical mass, has made it so that you cannot be in opposition or you're an enemy. So I think he's really fucked his political trajectory. Sorry, I don't know if I can swear on this or not. I don't know if he, really messed it up, but I think he did because it's going to take him a couple of years to come back with the Trump crowd when he, in all likelihood loses the primary. Mm-hmm. And I think that just the fact that more and more like two-time candidates that ain't going to get anywhere, 2-cent, 2-bit candidates that are going for a cabinet or the vice presidency, all it does is weaken Ron. I mean, someone else is going to get the moderate vote maybe, but the right-wing vote, which is what Ron is gunning for, is already too devotional to Trump. So any further Republicans that got on just split the camp that's against Trump. I mean, the math really doesn't work in his favor. All Trump needs to do is win a plurality of many of the states that award all of their delegates to one person. So
he's already between 50 and 60% in the polls.
I mean,
it's like, if he
can,
over,
Yeah, it is. And, maybe something unforeseen happens with this character. It always will. But it would take a real Hail Mary from Ron for that something to be so politically damaging that he doesn't end up as the Republican nominee in 2024.
Yeah, I think with Ron, it is yeah, definitely a very, very tough road for him in the future. And I think one big thing is he's term limited. He can't run in 2028 because he's out of office in 2026 in Florida's governorship, and it's just like
Right.
again, yeah, just so many reasons, just so uncharismatic, and he's just not going to be able to be in the national limelight. He doesn't have nearly the same kind of presence, as Trump. And I feel like probably the best explanation I guess I've seen, which there hasn't. I think there really should be the more from journalists about the difference between the DeSantis Trump support. But the big thing I've seen is education. Like and just more kind of like people who are more upper class, more educated, are supporting Ron, and then people who are not college educated, working class whites, the classic phrase that send a shiver down every kind of liberal spine. Is like they are
Right.
again continuing to be the big supporters of Trump, because again it's like the people, like they released an ad of DeSantis owning the libs or whatever, just with like him with like red sparks coming out of his eyes. Like it's like that was like their official campaign being like, look at this. It's just like very, very just abnormal is one way to put it.
Right.
So I feel like it could be a big hindrance for him as well.
I would definitely agree. I think the wind is against him, and with time we'll see more. It's hard to get a read on the law. It's very early still, but I would say the odds are pretty overwhelmingly in Trump's favor right now.
All right, yeah. Last story here, real quick. We have this Iowa weather reporter, Chris Gloniger, here to resign after years of death threats. Just got to be too much, it seems, for him. He was resigning from a local news after, why did he get the death threats? Essentially saying, oh, this drought, oh, this heat wave, that's probably because of climate change. That was apparently too much. I feel like, I don't know, are you with me in that? It kind of says something more about our culture at the time to be like, we are just becoming so less trusting of just basic facts and standard information.
I completely agree. I think that the place of science, the place of intellectual reality has fallen in the American hierarchy pretty far. I mean, climate change and the amount of like systematic disinformation that has been put out about climate change weakens everyone's sense of science as an authority. Like my dad has been occasionally a sparring partner of mine in the climate debate, one might say. And I feel that the disinformation that has been put out by right-wing media sources, but, funded covertly or at least kickstarted by, major petrochemical companies, has poisoned science as a discipline in the American consciousness for many people. And for other people,
I think COVID
perhaps
also played a big role.
Oh, for sure. I mean, for sure. COVID and the disinformation around that, again, that's really not been good for America and science as an authority. But maybe for others, perhaps it has strengthened it in reaction. Like people fighting for science against the forces of disinformation. But, realistically, it's not been good for science as a discipline.
Yes, I definitely, see your point there, and it's going to be the level of critical thinking as well is just kind of going hand in hand with the distrust, just people just being less and less able to, with AI, with all these things online, and just being able to be less able to discern if things are true. things, scams, things like that, just being more and more popular, more and more, pervasive. Just getting all these, literally even on a personal level, just getting like more and more texts. I feel like just with, a big one has been like your Amazon account. We had to lock you out of your Amazon account because you got the password wrong too many times. It's like, what the heck,
Yeah.
It's very. It's like I never even used to get those. It's just a sign of the times. All right.
For
that being
sure.
said, as we cross the hour mark, it's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much, James, for joining us, and we will be back. Got another guest coming up for you on Wednesday. See you then.